It was a moment of triumph for SpaceX fans everywhere. Against the expectations of many, NASA made the decision to award an exclusive HLS contract to Lunar Starship, a vessel that, ironically, is substantially larger than the SLS vehicle that will be transporting the Orion spacecraft all the way out to the moon. A vehicle that dwarfs Orion will be setting down on the moon in conjunction with the Artemis 3 mission. However, from the beginning, this award was plagued with problems. Both Blue Origin and Dynetics took their concerns up to the Government Accountability Office, and then when that was turned down, Dynetics wisely turned away. However, Blue Origin continued their dispute. They took it all the way to federal court. Jeff Bezos offered a multi-billion-dollar award to NASA in return for his vehicle to be considered as a second alternative. However, all of these efforts ended in failure, and SpaceX fans finally believed that the battle was over. But as most of us know, it wasn't. There were quite a few influential forces in the US government who believed very fervently that a second alternative to Artemis and HLS was needed in order to assure success. Indeed, Bill Nelson even believed this once he came to power. However, this was really looking to be impractical. Congress was not awarding sufficient money in order to build a second lander. What could possibly be done? Appendix N came out, but really this appendix was simply for research purposes, and the awards were relatively small compared to what was given out at the beginning of the original contract, and it just didn't seem that Appendix N was going to amount to anything anytime soon. But now there are plenty of letters left in the alphabet, and there is a new appendix to the HLS contract, and this one mandates that there be another alternative to SpaceX. Once again, unbelievably, Blue Origin is back in the running, even though they publicly stated that a new appendix to the HLS contract wouldn't work, that it was not viable and wouldn't provide real competition for Artemis. And yet, in spite of their public opposition to all of this, they're getting another shot at this. However, in my opinion, they have another competitor that stands a much better chance of being the second alternative, and that alternative will work very well in conjunction with Lunar Starship. Now, before we get started on all the nuances of Appendix P and Appendix N, I think it's important that we understand exactly what this contract was supposed to achieve in the first place. SLS and Orion was supposed to be unchanged. That was always a part of the Artemis program. Its ability to transport Orion and several astronauts into cislunar space, rendezvous with the Lunar Gateway, at least that was the original plan until the fate of the Gateway became somewhat in question, and then a lander would set down on the surface of the moon. Now, in my opinion, NASA's original intention was to have at least two competitors, each of which would carry out a demonstration mission and a crewed landing mission, depending on how the demonstration mission went. However, they simply didn't have the money for it. Congress gave them a tiny fraction of what they asked for, which left them in a very, very bad position, which means that they had no choice but to go with one provider, and the least expensive provider, which of course was SpaceX, because of the amount of money that Elon Musk was willing to invest in it personally. And as a result, we have one demonstration mission and one crewed mission scheduled for Lunar Starship for Artemis 3, and that's it. Whereas subsequent missions are always supposed to have at least two options available. Now, it would have been a hell of a lot more convenient to have these two options available from the beginning. But there is one thing that simply hasn't changed. Lunar Starship is going to remain the only HLS option for Artemis 3. There isn't enough time to develop anything else, so Lunar Starship is going to remain NASA's only alternative for HLS and Artemis 3. And as a matter of fact, this new announcement gives more funding to Lunar Starship to support not only development changes, but also a second crewed demonstration mission. And in my opinion, this second mission is to demonstrate the sustainability of Lunar Starship so that it will be able to compete under the sustainability contract without actually being part of that contract. So if Lunar Starship turns out to be the best option overall, then it's going to end up winning regardless of what subsequent appendices have been put onto this contract. However, on the other side of the equation, if Lunar Starship turns out to be too complicated from a logistical standpoint, or if its new technology, such as all of that LEO refueling, turns out to be impractical, NASA has no other options whatsoever until 2027 at the earliest, because of the fact that they didn't get a second competitor from the beginning. And this has always been a bad thing in my opinion. Even though I strongly believe in Starship, I also believe that trying to develop the most powerful rocket in human history for a lunar lander that's supposed to be available by 2025 is going to be difficult, to say the least. Now, don't get me wrong, SpaceX has demonstrated an ability to solve problems very quickly, no matter how difficult those problems may be. However, when it comes to LEO refueling, we have never transferred so much as a few liters of liquid from one container to another in microgravity. As I've mentioned in many previous videos, that sort of thing is extremely difficult to do and has many engineering challenges. And that's just with a few liters, let alone hundreds and hundreds of tons. That may prove to be a problem that takes years to overcome. And that's not the only thing. On top of that, this massive vehicle must also dock with the very tiny Orion or with the Lunar Gateway, and on top of that, it must also land on the lunar surface. A very large vehicle landing on regolith that we frankly don't know how stable it is. Is it going to be stable enough to support something this heavy, this tall, and this likely to topple over? Thus far, we haven't tried to land Starship on anything other than a concrete pad. I'm not saying it can't be done. What I am saying is it's going to be a lot easier to land this thing on the moon if it does have a landing pad of some kind. Now, some of you may be calling me a naysayer right now, but I think I'm just being a realist. Number one, this is the largest rocket in human history. That alone is a challenge. Number two, not only are we carrying out LEO refueling, something we've never really done on any kind of scale, but we're trying to do it with a massive ship and hundreds of tons of fuel. And finally, we're going to be trying to to land a very large rocket on the surface of the moon, and that's not even counting the difficulties of rapid reusability. And we have yet to launch this thing to orbit, in spite of our hopes that we would have gotten that done by the end of 2021. And there is every indication that the first orbital flight of Starship will not lead to a successful landing. The reusability of this ship may take some time to develop as well, and reusability is absolutely vital to the success of Starship in the future. However, this recent NASA decision is going to provide additional funding for Lunar Starship, and hopefully it will be able to carry out its mission. Even if it is able to carry it out, though, NASA may determine that the logistical difficulties of setting Lunar Starship down on the surface and using it for a deploy and return sort of lander, which is the original intention of Artemis, is not something that's going to be practical for a ship this big. Once again, I would remind you that it takes the same amount of delta V, roughly, to go all the way to the surface of the moon and rendezvousing with a gateway on the way, incidentally, and then back from the surface of the moon to the gateway and back to LEO for refueling, as it does to go all the way to Mars and back. That's a lot of fuel. It's going to require all of Starship's fuel in order to be able to accomplish all of that. But there's another solution that may not require that much fuel and that much complexity, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But here's one thing that really pisses me off. Under this new agreement, NASA now will be giving Blue Origin another chance to develop what's called a Sustainable Lunar Lander DDT&E, which stands for Development Through a Crewed Demonstration Mission. Now, this is essentially the same as the original contract, except it's focused exclusively on a sustainable landing system, not for any commercial transportation out to the gateway or anything along those lines as the original contract was. So what this means is all of the original partners in the national team are developing new landers to take another shot at this. Fortunately, they're not trying to do it all together, because what they came up with was a disaster. 2/3 of it not reusable, extremely dangerous, and frankly not very innovative. However, it was a little less expensive and something that could be developed quickly, but here's the advantage, and something I'm really counting on is the fact that all three of these companies are having to start over from scratch, and it is my hope that that's going to put them behind the 8 ball compared to their other competitor, a competitor that is innovative, and a competitor that, like SpaceX, is embracing 100% reusability. And yes, I said 100%. For those of you who have seen my recent videos about Alpaca, you may know that they are no longer making use of drop tanks, that the entire ship is now going to be reusable. In addition to that, the mass issues that this ship once had have now been completely resolved. They were created originally because Alpaca was having to use a lot of heavier off-the-shelf parts instead of things being developed in-house simply to meet a 2024 deadline. In addition to that, the expense of this vessel was also being driven by having to use off-the-shelf parts provided by other companies instead of building them in-house, one of the things that makes SpaceX more affordable. Now that Dynetics has more time to develop and build Alpaca, they are going to be more competitive cost-wise, certainly not as inexpensive as Lunar Starship. They don't have a billionaire founder, but really, is that the only consideration that we should be taking into account when we're going back to the moon? Who has the richest founder that can give us the most money to return to the moon on the best budget? Is this the best solution, or is it finding the best technology, the best overall product for the solution? And in my opinion, for the initial stages of Artemis, This vessel is the best for a sustainable lander. However, it's not the only ship that should be used. Lunar Starship should also be used in conjunction with Alpaca. Alpaca requires roughly 40 tons worth of fuel to go down to the lunar surface and then return to the gateway and rendezvous with it. This is something that requires several launches of the Vulcan Centaur. However, if you had a tanker Starship in orbit with 100 tons worth of fuel on board, you could make a minimum of 2 visits to the moon with Alpaca without anybody having to return to Earth. Meaning, of course, that Alpaca could make several visits to the lunar surface, or at least 2, without anybody having to go back to Earth for any sort of refueling. This is something that even Lunar Starship can't do. Lunar Starship, of course, has to go all the way back to LEO to get refueled before it can make another visit to the moon, whereas Alpaca, as long as it has a tanker in orbit, is able to do it indefinitely. This would get the most bang for our buck for every Artemis mission if these 2 vessels work in concert with one another. And on top of that, Alpaca could also create landing pads on the surface of the moon once we determine where we want to set up our bases, making the deployment of Lunar Starship in the future and the very large cargoes that it can carry a lot easier and a lot safer. And just as I've been recording this, I received an email from my partners over at Dynetics, and they provided me with a little bit more information about what gives Alpaca an edge over folks like Blue Origin or Northrop Grumman. They've been preparing for HLS sustainability since the start of their development. The whole redirection to try to get to the moon by 2024 was a diversion for NASA and the rest of the industry, and it distracted everybody from designing for sustainability. However, since NASA has again refocused on sustainability, Dynetics has done the same. They learned a lot of important lessons and streamlined their architecture to cleanly address NASA's sustainable lander requirements. Our current Appendix N contract efforts, and I am paraphrasing some of this, are directly attacking the highest risks for our sustainable lander. There's really exciting work going on in areas like in-space propellant transfer, key propulsion areas, cryogenic fluid management, all of which, by the way, are very important to Lunar Starship as well, and this work advances our system's technology, readiness, and positions as well for the upcoming NASA procurement. Beyond the hardware and software work that's going on, we've made improvements across the board to our lander design, to structures, propulsion, thermal control, avionics, power, software, and crew systems. We've proven that we can safely carry 4 crew members to and from locations across the lunar surface, not just the poles. Our lander survives periods of lunar darkness. Also, we've shown how our lander can carry payloads of many sizes, including very heavy and large cargo like a pressurized rover or a habitat. We can deliver the critical infrastructure that's necessary to maintain an ongoing human presence on the moon and to help stimulate a lunar economy. Importantly, our lander can place these payloads directly onto the lunar surface without cranes or elevators. All of those things are very important advantages. And on top of that, as I've said before, combining these advantages with the advantages of Lunar Starship and its colossal payload is a very good thing indeed. And what you're seeing right now is evidence of Dynetics successes in the past. They, unlike Blue Origin and other competitors, have actually put things into orbit or will do so very shortly. As you can see here, various components of SLS have been designed by Dynetics and are going to be going to the moon in a matter of weeks or perhaps a couple of months. So aside from the fact that Congress should have funded 2 competing landers from the very beginning, and this does put Artemis in a state of peril, hopefully everything is going to work out, and everything that was announced a couple of days ago is good news. It's a win-win for everybody. SpaceX is getting additional funding and more opportunities to travel to the moon to demonstrate their sustainability, and also another lander will be given a similar opportunity. And as I've described throughout this video, I do believe that since Dynetics has a head start on everybody else, and as far as reusability and sustainability is concerned, their lander has a leg up on anything that anybody else has to offer, with the exception of Lunar Starship. They should be the second competitor. That is my sincere hope. The only thing that might change this is if Jeff Bezos decides to offer billions of dollars of incentives up front, as he did before, to try to get a leg up price-wise. But given all of the problems that he's had on engineering a solution that has a high degree of reusability and, frankly, a high degree of safety as well, it's my opinion that NASA is going to make the decision that makes the most sense in the long run for the safety, security, and success of Artemis, rather than what's going to satisfy the whim of a billionaire. However, the guy does have a lot of money to continue suing NASA forever, so who knows what the final result is going to be. If you like my content and want to see more of it, please have a look at the description. There are many ways to support my channel and many benefits for my angry advocates, or simply subscribe to my channel and I will be very grateful. So until all of these contracts come to a conclusion and we have the best possible solutions for mankind's return to the lunar surface, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.